PBS Terra recently did a fascinating video on, I say recently, it was within the last year, did a fascinating video on where the riskiest places to live in the United States are going to be as global warming continues. We have not done enough to stop global warming. We are assured with our current strategy that it's just going to get worse. With that knowledge, they did the math and found out where are the riskiest places in the U.S. going to be. Let me show you.
As extreme weather increases all over the country, how do we figure out the riskiest places? First, let's look at the safest places. These are the safest 10% of counties in the U.S. based on projections of how climate will change by the middle of the century. As the humid climate niche characterized by mean annual temperatures around 55 degrees Fahrenheit moves north, some places that are particularly cold now might actually get safer because, as we know from previous episodes, the most deadly weather in the U.S. is extreme cold.
All right, now just one caveat there. So in that list of safest places, let me just give you an idea of how safe we're talking. You'll see Michigan has the west side of Michigan is featured there. Just under that lowest southern square on the west side of Michigan. Just under that is where I was a radio show host. And one of my very first jobs there was to cover the flooding happening in Spring Lake, Michigan. And similar to this, I had to tell people what they can do. I had to tell people where to get sandbags to protect their businesses. I drove around getting film for it, and there was parking lots flooded, community efforts to stack sandbags because Michigan has had Lake Michigan has had some of the worst flooding ever. We heard a lot about that on the other side. Some of the highest water levels, which resulted in flooding in coastal communities. On the other side of that lake is Chicago, Illinois. We heard a lot about it from them. What we did not hear as much about was the erosion, because flooding, if you talk to the Army Corps of Engineers, as I learned covering this, erosion or flooding isn't the only cause of erosion. High water levels are not the only cause of erosion. High water levels following low water levels are. And as a result of a year with one of the lowest water levels, followed by record water levels, followed by low water levels, in other words, global warming causing these bizarre spikes, I actually watched a house fall into the lake because of this. So even though you see safe areas here, it is talking very broadly. Because if you are by water, I'll tell you, global warming is going to become more and more of a factor in your life.
We know from previous episodes, the most deadly weather in the U.S. is extreme cold. This ProPublica study also lists the most dangerous U.S. counties, and we'll get to that in a bit. But first, let's add to our map mid-century projections for flood, storm, fire, drought, and heat risk. Starting with one of the most local hazards, flooding. This map shows the number of properties impacted by future floods due to rain, overflowing rivers, high tides, and storm surge. Many coastal towns will be impacted by rising sea levels, and places like West Virginia will be slammed with heavy rain as the climate warms. According to Redfin, by 2050, 84% of properties in Cape Coral, Florida, and 98% of properties in New Orleans will be at risk for flooding. Houston is also an outlier on this list due to the sheer number of properties at risk, as we saw when Hurricane Harvey submerged the city under its record-shattering rains in 2017. But what about storms? It seems like these extreme precipitation events are causing more and more damage as the climate warms. The top 10 cities impacted by storms are mostly in the Northeast, but Portland and Seattle, both infamously rainy cities, also appear here. Now, let's look at fire. Here, the map shifts dramatically to the west and southeast. This map shows the annual likelihood of wildfire in 2050. The places most at risk of devastating wildfires aren't cities, but instead houses and developments on the edge of wildlands and places with lots of fire.
Man, that shot. Let's see.
And developments
that
on the
shot
edge
right
of
there.
wildlands.
This
and
guy
places.
trying to tell just explaining to his kid what's going on. I wonder so much about that guy. What's he telling his kid? Why is he bringing his kid out there to show him this? Is he trying to show him that everything's okay? Is he trying to show him that? Is he trying to show him that, hey, this is the consequence of X or Y? I mean, it's a young kid. I'm sure he's not talking politics with him, but breaks my heart to see that. And I certainly hope that whatever conversation he's having with his kid about the gigantic fire outside their neighborhood is not one that families around the world have to keep having. I hope we take this seriously.
With lots of fire. And it's not just forested areas that are at risk, but also the grass and shrublands of regions like the Great Basin, particularly places that are getting drier. Which brings us to drought. This map shows decreases in precipitation over the last 30 years compared to the 20th century. But what about the future? Well, here are the top 5 cities projected to be impacted by drought in 2050. 4 of them rely.
Okay, I did want to pause it because they kind of blast past this here. So Colorado Springs, that was a surprise to me. I don't know as much about Colorado, but I just didn't picture it as a drought-prone area. The rest, yeah, it's more or less what I'd imagine. What is perhaps the least shocking is that the places that are going to get hit worst by this, but not just droughts, but climate change in general. Places that are going to get it worse are going to be Republican controlled. And I'm very curious to find out what spin the GOP tries to put on this. I won't name names, but I full on worked with a weatherman once. Again, I worked at a lot of news stations, so I'm not going to narrow it down. I don't think it's appropriate to poke fun at old coworkers. But as to illustrate the point, I worked with a weatherman once who said, I'm not sure if global warming's real. A weatherman. Won't surprise you to hear he was deeply conservative. That is how pervasive their messaging has been about global warming. That they have somebody whose job it is to understand how weather systems work, not sold on whether or not global warming is even happening. So I'm going to be very curious to see how Republicans in their areas where they are most often voted for, how they try to pitch, if the party even still exists, what is happening to their people.
On water from the Colorado River, which is already in a decades-long drought, and large water use cuts in the basin are inevitable. Lastly, let's look at the second most common cause of weather-related deaths in the U.S., heat. This map shows projected days over 100 degrees in 2053. Oh man, Florida, Texas, and Arizona are looking pretty toasty. Phoenix is hotter than anywhere else, but in Florida, temperatures don't need to be as high for it to become dangerous because it's also humid there. That makes it harder for the body to cool itself by sweating. If we take a look at the combined risk of all these climate impacts, we start to see how different regions will fare. And the Southeast will pretty clearly bear the brunt of climate change. And now let's add back in the data we looked at earlier, but this time for the riskiest 10% of counties. At this point, we're beginning to get a clearer picture of some places you might want to think twice about before moving.
All right, so let's just hold it there for a moment. Actually, let's get my dome off the screen. Look at that. Look at where it is going to be the most dangerous to live because of global warming. I mean, Florida is covered. If you're talking about regions, oh my gosh, Florida, absolutely going to be a nightmare. And unfortunately, they're going to be the least prepared for it because Ron DeSantis will spend the remainder of his time as governor doing anything but taking reasonable steps to deal with this. Texas with Greg Abbott, is he going to do anything to prepare for this? No. No, he is not. So these are places that we know are going to require steps taken ahead of time to counteract this. The overheating, the drought, the flooding, what we are expecting. And they are least prepared. Haven't heard much about Louisiana, but I can only imagine. If you want to take steps to prevent this to prevent tragedy in America, show this to Republicans. Show this to Republican voters. Not me, because they're going to be hearing, all they'll hear is a guy saying Republicans bad, Republicans bad. For the record, Republicans bad. But, no, just show them the PBS Terra. That simple. You can frame it however you want to frame it. But, as in, for example, frame it as, look, don't buy property here. It's going to be terrible. Appeal to greed if you must. But ultimately, yeah, make them aware that this currently has real world consequences. Watching a house fall into a lake sure did it for me. If you've got someone in your life who's voting Republican, just show them that. And you can even ask them, what do you think Greg Abbott's doing for his people in Texas right now? Privatizing more power grids, maybe? Ridiculous. There's also something you can personally do to directly affect this. And it will be a drop in the bucket, but hey, you get enough drops, you fill the bucket. Give fossil fuel industries, including coal, including oil, give them less power. Give them less of your paycheck. Right now, you have to give people money you have to give money to people who are wrecking the planet. Because otherwise, you cannot drive. You cannot turn the lights on. But you can reduce how much of your money they get. If you have the means, install solar panels on your house. If you are looking to buy a new car, strongly consider getting a hybrid or getting a full-on electric car. I would, in terms of practicality, just right now, I would recommend a hybrid because you are then able to take a long road trip if you want. In fact, we had a viewer point this out. You're able to take a long road trip if you want, but for your daily driving, for your small trips where the majority of the gasoline would be literally burned, you can simply rely on the car's battery. It's also much cheaper. In the long run, it's a better financial decision for you, and the government will help you buy your vehicle. I have a link in the description listing tax credits. If you buy a car that was made in 2022 or before, or if you buy a car, or rather, if you bought a car in 2022, you want to get a little money for it. It was an electric vehicle. Great. Click on the link. If you buy a car now and onward, there's a link for that as well, 2023 and on. The reason for the two links is that the laws changed slightly, but the end result is the same. You get a tax credit for buying an electric vehicle. So save yourself a little bit of money and do what the governors of the states most affected by global warming will not do. Help their people out. Reduce the hurt that is going to be brought upon these people. Real Bill P says, when I taught at VA Tech, I worked alongside the NWS office. They have been concerned for decades. Ooh. Sociology professors are including the climate crisis in the curriculum. Yeah, that's probably a good idea on their part. At a minimum, we should be preparing the next generation of leaders and industry participants for what to expect. It's going to get harsh. Surreal Edifice, I love that name. Surreal Edifice says they will dismiss this as fake news. Yeah, they will. They will. Similarly, if you want a template for how, say, a Texas governor will act when their privatization decisions end up affecting their people, just look at how Greg Abbott responds to the energy crisis in Texas. They have a grid infrastructure which is just terrible, and it got that way because Abbott privatized their electrical grid. What does he do? He blames Biden. I have no idea how that logic works, but he blames Biden. You're right. They'll keep on doing that. If this stuff, however, becomes common knowledge, and particularly if we lay the groundwork now and we tell people about this stuff now, knowing damn well that it's going to happen within the next 10, 15 years, you make it part of the common conversation that we know which places are going to be hit worse. We can keep referring to that and do a very constructive, we told you so. So that hopefully, at the very least, there is vengeance taken at the ballot box. Speaking of privatization, one of the great minds of our time, Robert Reich, talked about when it is and is not a good idea to privatize an industry. One thing I like about his breakdown here is that he doesn't fall entirely on one side or the other. He does acknowledge, hey, in some cases, privatization's just fine. It works well, it does its job. Fair enough. But the neoliberal mindset that infected all Republicans, 100% of Republicans, and all of our corporate Democrats, where they believe that the way to make a system efficient is to ensure that somebody in charge of it literally profits off of that system. It has caused the American government to just go crazy and privatize everything they can possibly get away with. Let's have a look at what Robert Reich has to say.
Privatization, 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 privatization. It's all you hear from Republicans. But what does it actually mean?
Whoa, it's quite an intro.
Generations ago, America built an entire national highway system, along with the largest and best public colleges and universities in the world, also public schools and national parks, majestic bridges, dams that generated electricity for entire regions, public libraries, public research. But around 1980, the moneyed interests began pushing to privatize much of this, giving it over to for-profit corporations. Privatization, the argument went, would boost efficiency and reduce taxes. The reality has been that privatization too often only boosts corporate bottom lines. For example, consider Trump's proposal for infrastructure. The problem is that it depends on private developers who'd make money off of both tax subsidies and private tolls. So the public would get charged twice without any guarantee that the resulting roads, bridges, or rapid transportation systems would be built where they're most needed. Now, it's true that private for-profit corporations can do certain tasks very efficiently, and some privatization has worked. But the goal of corporations is to maximize profits for shareholders, not to serve the public interest. The question should be, what's best for the public? Now, here are 5 rules of thumb for when public services should not be privatized. Number 1, don't privatize when the purpose of the service is to bring us together, reinforcing our communities, helping us connect with one another across class and race, linking up Americans who'd otherwise be isolated or marginalized. This is why we have a public postal service that serves everyone, even small rural communities where for-profit private carriers often won't go.
I was trying to find the guy's name. It's killing me that I can't remember it, but let's go back just a bit. Okay, quite a bit. Let's see if you can say it again.
The interests began pushing to privatize much of this.
He said in the 1980s, that's when this huge push for privatization began. Yes, it did. Yes, it certainly did. That was when neoliberalism became a massive part of our government. There was an attempt to get it started in the 1970s under Nixon, actually. Now Nixon and the CIA, I hate that this is true American history because it makes you sound like a crazy when you say it, but it's a matter of fact. Nixon and the CIA helped Pinochet get in power in Chile because the previous administration had nationalized the copper industry as well as one other industry. I can't recall which. It scared the hell out of Nixon. It also made Chile an economic powerhouse for a couple of years there. But these were American companies that had owned so much of Chile's resources. So they didn't care for that. They helped produce the coup d'etat that put Pinochet in power, and Pinochet followed the tenets of neoliberalism. What happened? An immediate essentially economic destruction in Chile. They even privatized the country's Social Security, which you will find many Republicans trying to do. The only thing that saved Chile as a country was that they held on to the nationalization of one of the copper companies, and that just allowed them to survive. So then we had the gas crisis, problems when the Middle Eastern countries did not want or did not sell gasoline to the U.S. anymore because the U.S. supported Israel in Israel's 7-front war with Middle Eastern countries. Set the politics aside, the result of that gas crisis meant we really couldn't kick it off in the U.S. until Reaganomics and deep believers in neoliberalism just ran amok and gutted so much of American industry. Gutted so much of America's production, I should say, by privatizing. Now, onto the what should not be privatized.
Giving it a The goal of corporations is to maximize profits for shareholders, not to serve the public interest. The question should be, what's best for the public? Now, here are 5 rules of thumb for when public services should not be privatized.
And also, the instances in the U.S. where they very much are privatized. And you will note they are some of the things that lefties have had the biggest issues with, as in objections to these industries. Have a gander.
Number 1, don't privatize when the purpose of the service is to bring us together, reinforcing our communities, helping us connect with one another across class and race, linking up Americans who'd otherwise be isolated or marginalized. This is why we have a public postal service that serves everyone, even small rural communities where for-profit private carriers often won't go. This is all.
The GOP has been after the Postal Service. Basically, not the GOP, conservatives have been after the Postal Service basically since its creation. Most recently, Trump put Louis DeJoy in charge of heading the Postal Service. Basically, to gut it, to make it not function. They put in rules that requires the Postal Service to pay for, 50 years to have just in reserve 50 years of employee retirement programs. There's no other institution that functions like that. The goal is simply to make it fail. One thing that I strongly dislike about Joe Biden is that Louis DeJoy is still in his position. He hasn't been booted out. There's no reason to keep that guy there. He should be booted out with a size 13. I mean, my God.
Also why we value public education and need to be very careful that charter schools and other forms of so-called school choice don't end up dividing our children and our communities rather than pulling them together.
Betsy DeVos started in the state of Michigan doing that. She was a big proponent of taking money from public schools and giving them in the form of tax breaks, I believe, to parents if they put their children in a charter school. It's a great way to ensure that the community wherein you live doesn't get funding for its schools. It's a great way to ensure that rich parents can grab their kids and say, you're not going to hang out with those filthy poor kids. You're going to get a proper education. And a great way to ensure that the poor kids don't get a proper education. Absolutely shameful. DeVos and her multiple yachts should be just booed everywhere she goes. Literally. She walks in a door, she shouldn't even register the word boo anymore. You ever live by a highway and you stop hearing the whoosh of traffic until somebody reminds you that it's there? That should be Betsy DeVos's whole life from this point forward, except with the word boo. Boo, Betsy DeVos, boo. By the way, her brother Eric Prince is a private military guy. I wonder if that'll turn up in here.
Number 2, don't privatize when the service is less costly when paid for through tax revenues than through prices set by for-profit corporations. America's hugely expensive for-profit health insurance system, for example, is designed to sign up healthy people and avoid sick people, while running up huge tabs for advertising and marketing and giving big rewards to shareholders and executives, which is why the administrative costs of Medicare are a tiny fraction of the cost of for-profit medical insurance.
Look at that. Now, that's because you're not paying a bunch of people to advertise the products. You are not paying a bunch of people to facilitate, to convince Americans that the best way to run this thing is to have corporatists involved in it. Massive change in the administrative costs. And that doesn't even scratch the surface of the savings that American people would get if we had Medicare for all. We should absolutely, it shouldn't even be a question at this point. We should absolutely nationalize the health care industry in the United States. To give you an idea, of how ridiculous our current healthcare system is, 11 of the richest countries on earth were measured and had their healthcare systems compared to each other. The U.S. came in 11th in all categories but one. And the category we did not come in last in is what happens to somebody once they're already in it. What is their quality of treatment once they've already gotten over that barrier of even being able to use it? And we didn't come in first either. The U.S. has an absolutely embarrassing healthcare industry. Oh, that's foreboding. And we should be embarrassed by it. I certainly am. It should not be a question at this point any longer whether or not we should nationalize our healthcare industry. The only question we should be asking, the only debate that should be had on the political stage is whose country's model should we follow? My pitch is Norway because they came in, they got top marks in that survey. But you know what? Canada's isn't bad either. There's a lot to be said for all of these. The only one we know we definitely shouldn't have is our current system. And here's Robert Reich breaking down why. Another way to put this is simply that if you agree that everybody needs the service, everybody requires it, then you've got to stop having the debate over whether or not it should be privatized. The answer is no. If we know everyone needs it, then it must be nationalized, because then we can all agree like reasonable people how it can be distributed, which should mean everybody is able to use it.
And why we need Medicare for all.
Boom.
Number 3, don't privatize when the people who are supposed to get the service have no power to complain when services are poor. This is why for-profit prison corporations have proven again and again to violate the constitutional rights of prisoners, and why for-profit detention centers for refugee children at the border pose such grave risks. Number 4, don't privatize when those who are getting the service have no way to know they're receiving poor quality. The marketers of for-profit colleges, for example, have every incentive to exploit young people and their parents because the value of the degrees they are offering can't easily be known, which is why nonprofit colleges and universities have proven far more trustworthy.
Trump University, as an example. Yeah, for-profit colleges are, I will acknowledge that some have operated in a way that has been beneficial to their students. I still think they should be made illegal. It's like saying some drug dealers have been really helpful to their customers. I bet you got enough of them. I bet some have been, but largely it's a problem. Shouldn't have any for-profit colleges. We should have. I feel, at a minimum, there must always be, at least in terms of colleges, there must always be a nationalized alternative. Even if you want to keep for-profit colleges, fine, but there must be a way that somebody with no money can have a reasonable crack at the American dream. That's supposed to be the point. So let him hit this last one here, and then we got some comments I'm anxious to read.
Number 5, finally, don't privatize where for-profit corporations face insufficient competition to keep prices under control. Giant for-profit defense contractors with power over how contracts are awarded generate notorious cost overruns because they're accountable mainly to their shareholders, not to the public. In other words, for-profit corporations can do some things very well, including, especially, maximizing shareholder returns. But when the primary goal is to serve the public rather than shareholders, we need to be careful not to sacrifice the public interest to private profits.
Big fan of that man right there. No notes, but plenty of additions. First of all, I can't believe I understated how bad the treatment of the post office is. Surreal Edifice says 100 years of benefits in advance. They are funding retirements for people who have not been born yet. Yeah, wild. And a correction issued. Yes, it wasn't 50 years. It was 100 years. That's insane. That is an absolutely blatant attempt to just destroy the post office. One of the services that Americans constantly say they are most satisfied with. It's insane to me that Republicans get away with doing some of the nonsense that they get up to. Real Bill P says, DeJoy also disassembled sorting machines. Sabotage mail-in voting, anyone? Just saying. Yeah, wholeheartedly agree. Surreal Edifice says, I remember when Newt Gingrich went on with Aslan Camerota on CNN and got into an argument with her about the facts and told her that he would go with feelings every time. They go by vibes. That is it exactly. Yes. Republicans, their entire political party, I suppose, the career of every Republican is it's reliant upon their audience being either completely uninformed or misinformed. And then, at least up until 2015, they would get a guy that looks just like me and sounds just like me to get in front of a microphone and say some very reasonable sounding things that would result in harm being done to the United States. They'd say things like, we have to protect our country. And what they mean is we have to invade a country that hasn't picked a fight with us. Or they would mean they would say we have to ensure that the post office is run efficiently. And what they would mean is we have to try to sabotage this thing so that we can privatize it. That's what they would mean. But they would say very reasonable sounding things, and they would know that their voters were trained to only listen to Rush Limbaugh, to only watch Fox News, and to therefore not have any idea what was actually going on. It was so bad that Obama installed or created an act that required language in bills to be understandable by average folks if you sit down and read it. And by the way, that has, credit where it's due, that has had a big difference in people's understanding of politics. Although more credit where it's due, of all people, to Donald Trump. Having our lives constantly in danger because of political decisions really got people paying attention to politics. I would encourage you, there's a wicked video on this, I would encourage you, as far as what you can do, to get your MAGA friends familiar with this. It's how do I identify misinformation, disinformation, etc. Consider the source, triple check the source, identify the author, inspect the URL. We always make fun of the fictional freedomeagle.net. That's why. Inspect the URL, get people used to looking at that. Seek alternative viewpoints. Listen to what the criticisms are of the arguments you find yourself agreeing with. This goes for us too, by the way. Even if you come out the other side of that thinking, no, I'm still on the side I'm on, you then know how the other side is attacking it, and you're better prepared to defend it, should it come to that in a conversation. And then, of course, think before you share. Yeah. Encourage them to do that heartily. So, with privatization, sum up Robert Reich here. To sum up Robert Reich, schools, healthcare, prisons, education, and the military. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. What can you do? You can contact your representative. Pick one of those. I would recommend healthcare because, people should live. Contact your representative and tell them that in your state, you do not want, in fact, go for the gold. You do not want these things privatized. You don't want the healthcare privatized. You have a link in the description. It'll tell you who your governor is, who your representative is from your district, who your 2 senators are. Contact all of them or contact some of them. If you're talking to your governor, keep it towards state issues. Say, I don't want privatized schools in this state. We have an interest in public education. I want public education funded. I don't want private education funded in any way by the government. This constant pressure, this consistent pressure has 2 benefits. One, it pushes them towards your way of thinking. But 2, it also lets them know, even if they are going to fight you, it lets them know that there's people that disagree with what they're trying to do who are active in politics, active enough to look up who their representatives are and to contact them. And then that will temper the ways they try to go against you. Because even if they're not going to try to please you, they might try to not make you that mad. This is how we have our timid Democrats of the modern era. The corporate Democrats who are just gun-shy about doing anything. It's because they grew up in politics. They came about during a time when they would get hammered. They'd get letter campaigns, just absolutely hammered with input from right-wingers. And it was a vicious cycle. They would then do very centrist things, and then they would go to the polls and they'd barely make it back into office or not make it into office. And they'd say, oh, I didn't go right-wing enough. Let's do the opposite of that. Let's adopt the tactics that worked for the bad guys, and let's use it for the good. Contact your representative. Tell them you do not want schools, healthcare, the military, or prisons. Oh my God, especially prisons. Privatized. Further, the easiest thing to say is just to push for Medicare for all. Say, if you're talking to your representative, not your governor, but your representative from your district, tell them, push for Medicare for all. That's what I want. That's why I want you in Washington saying it. It's your job to represent me. I am among your constituents. I want you to push for Medicare for all. I don't want you to push for a half-assed solution. Medicare for all, end of story. Well, let's have a look at some of these comments. I like to ask, if you were wrong, would you even want to know about it? Now, that's a great question from Surreal Edifice. And if they say anything other than yes, they aren't open to anything yet. True. And in asking the question, you're going to pry them open just a little bit. You're going to make them consider that. That is a great, great question. If you were wrong, would you even want to know about it? Excellent point, my friend. Well, it has been a wonderful 2 for Tuesday. I thank you for joining me. We got, per audience suggestion, we're starting interviews. We're going to do the very first one tomorrow that will be recorded, and I think I'm going to play it during either that live show or the following. I hope you'll tune in for that. It's with the True North Eager Beaver podcast. Really looking forward to those folks being on the show. And I'm going to go study up. I will see you then. Thank you for joining me. This has been WYCD Wicked. That stands for What You Can Do. I'm your old pal Jake. I'll see you next time.